morning. Welcome. Welcome to Fourth Presbyterian Church, to our church school hour, and to the first of the 2020 Pellet-Wearn Lecture series. Before we begin, I want to say thanks, as becoming a tradition, to say thanks to Deborah Schneider, who every year is coordinating our refreshments table. If you would like to help prepare a dish, a little something for the table, then you can let Deborah know. She'll be glad to receive your help in that department. It is a little after 10, so we should get started as you all continue to find your refreshments and your coffee and make your way to the table, to the tables or to your chair. Let us begin with a word of prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, on the mountain in Galilee, you sent your disciples into all the world, saying, "Go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And through your servant Paul, you called the church to live our life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind, having the same love and being in full accord in the faith of the gospel. Yet you know how hard that has been for us. You know how we have taken your gift and divided it. As we reflect on the story of your church today and in the weeks to come, give us ears to hear your call anew, your call to be your people in the world, one people with one faith, in one baptism, proclaiming one Lord, one God and Father of all, in whose name we pray. Amen. Dr. Adrian Bird currently serves as Affiliate Assistant Professor of Church History at Union Presbyterian in Charlotte, teaching courses in history, mission, and evangelism, and the Christian encounter with world religions. Dr. Bird has extensive international cross-cultural experience, having lived and worked in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the U.S. Adrian is married to Reverend Julie Walkup Bird, who is the pastor of McGregor Presbyterian Church in Irmo. Adrian and Julie are parents of two children, Nathan and Lydia. Julie and Adrian served together as mission partners in residence with the Church of South India, after which Adrian returned to school to complete his doctoral studies at the University of Edinburgh before returning to teach in the States. We are grateful to have Adrian with us for a second year in a row, and for his willingness to drive up from Columbia for 6 weeks in a row to share his good thoughts with us at this year's 2020 Pellet-Wearn Lecture. It is my pleasure to present to you Dr. Adrian Bird.
Thank you, Mike. Gosh, is it really a year since I was last here? Where does it go? You know, you've all made me feel rather special. It's quite nice to be invited just once to come and lead these lectures, but to be invited back is very, very kind of you. And I'm excited about this next 6 weeks and what we can learn together. As with last year, I'm hoping that there will be some interactive conversations during the week. So if there's anything that I say or anything that you see on the screens that tweaks your interest, then please let Jackie or Jeremy or Mike know, and we can begin a conversation online. Or you can have that information fed to me so that I can address any of your issues or questions in later lectures. Does that make sense? So I hope that this is going to be as interactive as possible. So the theme this year, as opposed to last year, which was Christian encounters with world religions, is to look at some history, Christian history. And one of the greatest challenges, I think, to Christian identity in the 21st century. And that is this: Christianity or Christianities? Startling challenges for Christian thought in the modern world. So that's a rough idea about where we'll be going this next 6 weeks. We're struck by this figure. As we try to categorize and understand the great breadth of Christianity across the globe in the 21st century, we are faced with the fact that there are around 41,000 different ways of categorizing the differences within us. 41,000, let's say, denominations or categories or way of saying this group different than this Christian group. Now, I'm not too focused on the particular number. The reality is it's a lot. And for some people that might be a great celebration, and for others that might be a great concern as we scratch our heads and think about unity and Christian identity in the world today. So from Lamin Sanneh, who's at Yale Divinity School, he says that the wide spectrum of theological views and ecclesiastical traditions represented are part of Christianity's stunningly diverse profile. Stunningly diverse profile. Is this a good thing? Is this not so good a thing? And that Christianity is the most diverse and pluralist religion in the world. Now, we could argue with that. There are other religions that have great diversity in them too, but we're focusing on Christianity. Again, is our pluralism from within something that is a great strength, or is it a weakness and a challenge? This is the territory that we'll be walking in over the next few weeks. The slide here is an image of the globe, 1910 and 2010. And basically, if the map area of the map gets a little bigger, that means there's more Christians in that particular part of the world. So if we contrast the blue area here, we look at United States and Latin America. Over here, look at Africa. Look at Africa here just in 100 years. It's just a bitty little blob on the top part of the screen there, but look at the massive increase in the 20th century. In fact, there's probably never been a greater seismic shift than what's happening in Christianity in Africa today. Andrew Walls, the great missiologist, will be as bold to say that the future of Christianity really depends on what happens to Christianity in Africa over this century. I might add, let's add Asia and Latin America to that. But these shifts that are taking place globally are quite significant. We have in Christianity over 2 billion people who profess some affinity to the Christian religion. And as with any other tradition, it can be perceived both positively and negatively. With that many Christians in the world, we imagine that most people in the world have encountered a Christian, and for some, that's a really good encounter. It's a positive and enriching encounter, but for others, that's actually a very negative encounter, depending on the Christianity that is brought forward. Is it good news, or is it a mix of good news and bad news, or is it actually just bad news for the hearer? And the perception of Christianity is not one that only comes from outside Christianity. We know that from within it, you all know from within it, that there are those who claim to be Christians who we might slightly cringe at, depending on where they fall in a particular spectrum that feel comfortable to us. We know this. Last year I expressed that I feel a great commonality with many people who are outside of Christianity. I feel more comfortable speaking in dialogue within the interfaith movement than I do with some who are rather on the opposite end of the Christian spectrum to where I am. So what does that mean for Christian identity in the world today? I love this. I think I might have shown it last year. But with capturing some shifts, and this captures a great deal, I think. We think about the pre-modern world, if you like, the medieval period. There's the little dot there. It's very static. Because God put it there, and that's the way it's always been. So just find your place in it, and that's the way the world is. And then we get into the modern period, which we'll be talking about today. This is our onwards and upwards with inevitable progress right to the top, breaking new barriers. And then we get into the postmodern squiggle. The postmodern squiggle. And we'll get there maybe in week 6. But really, we're in the squiggle right now. And it's quite a challenge for us. So we're going to start our journey over this 6 weeks in the 18th century with the Enlightenment. Listen to this quote. The modern history of Christian thought begins not with the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, but rather with the movement of the 18th century known as the Enlightenment. That's a bold claim. That's a bold claim. The modern history of Christian thought begins not with the Protestant Reformation, but rather with the 18th century movement known as the Enlightenment. Now, that is not to discount what happened in the Protestant Reformation, of course, but is to say that really the shaping of the modern world as we know it today comes from the 18th century. And we say the 18th century, but Enlightenment thinking, of course, begins earlier than that. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment that begins in the 17th century. But really the 18th century is when it becomes rather radical and starts to shape the modern world. So we might see from Thomas Jefferson, he says that the three greatest men that ever lived without any exception. And who are the three that he goes for? Francis Bacon, who gives us the scientific method. That question of we start from a place of doubt, we set a hypothesis, and then we go about testing that hypothesis through scientific method to be able to prove our case. John Locke, who gives us the idea of the tabula rasa, we'll talk about that in a little while, and also the notion of how the parliament and the monarchy is supposed to govern the world, and of course Isaac Newton. And so we see already the impact of Jefferson on the blueprint of the United States, and his influences are drawn from the Enlightenment era. So we do well to pay attention to it. Where is the Enlightenment when we talk about that? And it's a very difficult thing to grasp. But really we're thinking about Western Europe, and in particular we're thinking about France. But one of the exciting things about this movement, in a time, in a world in which nations are being built, from the Reformation onwards, we get the formation of nations. Spain becomes Spain, France becomes France, and so on and so forth. But this Enlightenment is not really a nationalistic thing. It is an idea. It's ideas that will transcend any notions or national boundaries. It's an intellectual movement that knows no boundaries, which is why it will quickly spread around the world. Let's just take a step back to the medieval era. What was the conception of the world, certainly in Western Europe at this time, prior to the Enlightenment? And it was this: that the church is the most influential agency in the medieval world. There is no institution that has the influence or the power that the church has, the Roman Catholic Church in particular. Extra ecclesia nulla salus means outside the church there is no salvation. So while in Western Europe there is great diversity and there is a lot of tension and a lot of dynamic, a lot of movements, really the church has been able to construct a narrative that is somewhat universal, at least in the context of Western Europe. Without the church there is no salvation. Outside the church there is no salvation. This is a rather constructed cosmology that everybody fits into. Here's a hierarchy. It's very simplistic, but hopefully there's some benefit in that. Nobody doubted, at least in Western Europe, that God was at the top of the hierarchy. This was not questioned. We are not in the realms of atheism yet. Nobody is doubting the existence of God, and nobody is doubting that God is the top of the apex, if you like. And just beneath God is the church. And as we've just shown on that slide, it has a considerable amount of influence and impact and power in Western Europe. Just beneath the church, we have the kings and the nobles. And what we'll find over, well, we have since the 10th, 11th, 12th century, there's been a competition between the church and the kings and nobles to see who's actually the top there of that hierarchy. From the 12th century, it was really the church, but from then on, it seems like the monarchies and the nobility are trying to assert their authority over the church. Eventually, of course, this will come crumbling down. And then underneath that, we have the ordinary folks, if you like, the you and the me, or perhaps also the peasants. The peasants, their role in life was to pay and was to pray. Pay, pray, and obey. This is your role. I'm not saying this is your role in life. And if you don't like it, well, that's just talk. Nobody challenged it because this was the cosmology of the day. And then beneath that we have the natural or the material world. This is the work on the land. Now, let me just say that this is going to come crumbling down. This whole hierarchy will come crumbling down. If we think about the 20th century and the rise of the atheist movement and the God is dead movement. So if you like, let's just take and move God to the side here, or even off the screen for some. The church, well, we can imagine that for many, if it is on the screen, it doesn't take a top position. So let's just move that to the side, or for some even off the screen. Kings, nobles, well, the Enlightenment period is an era of revolutions, and so let's remove those from the screen or move them slightly to the side. Ordinary folk. These are the folks who in the Enlightenment period are going to be lifted up or certainly become center to the screen. And we think about the 21st century and the refocus on the world, on the material, the green movements that's going on now, the talk of climate change really lifts what was once at the bottom, fairly high on the spectrum, on the hierarchy. And I think the question is, well, the Enlightenment is the thing that is going to make this hierarchy shatter. So the question becomes, how do you put together the pieces that help you navigate through your world? If it's not this, what is it? What is it for you personally, or what is it for the church? Where does it put God? Where does it put the church? Where does it put the people? Is it even a hierarchy anymore, or is it now concentric circles? Well, the shapes are endless, aren't they? But with it tumbling down, what will it then re-emerge looking like? And as we'll see, it can look like a whole range of different things, depending on who you might ask. Certainly, up to the Enlightenment, there is reason. There has always been a place for reason, but it has known its place underneath faith. It's another hierarchy, and reason becomes below faith. As Roger Bacon, not to be confused with scientific method, Francis Bacon, he says this in the 13th century: knowledge which takes no account of Christian dogma leads men and women straight to hell. Therefore, the task of philosophy is to offer proofs for the truth of the Christian religion. Yes, there is reason. The scholastic period of the 12th and 13th century certainly used and applied reason, but only to support the things of faith. This too will change. What need of curiosity? In 1 Corinthians we read this: for the wisdom of the world is foolishness to God. As the scriptures say, he traps the wise in the snare of their own cleverness. For writers who are opposed to Christianity and religion in general, like Peter Gay, this has been the snare of religion, the snare of Christianity, in basically extinguishing the light of human reason under a hierarchy of religious overtones. Peter Gay says, with its triumph in the 4th century, Christianity secured the victory of infantile credulity. One by one, the lamps of learning were out, and for centuries darkness covered the earth. Ooh. So what is the Enlightenment? So we turn to Immanuel Kant for some guidance here. Kant says this: enlightenment is the human's emergence from self-imposed knowledge. Knowledge is the inability to use one's own understanding, your own understanding, without another's guidance. This knowledge is self-imposed if its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but in indecision and lack of courage to use one's own mind without another's guidance. Let's simplify that a little bit. He writes this: it's so comfortable to be a minor, to be young, to be immature. If I have a book that thinks for me, a pastor who acts as my conscience — Mike, I hope you're not acting as the conscience of everybody here — a physician who prescribes my diet and so on, I have no need to exert myself. I have no need to think, if only I can pay. It's a bold challenge. Dare to know, says Kant. Dare to know. Sapere aude. Have the courage to use your own understanding becomes the motto of the Enlightenment. So it's this encouragement for folks like you and me to become mature, not to remain immature like the tree that remains a sapling. Feed it with the waters of life and understanding of thought. Feed it with the nurturing growth of reason. What is it for Kant that keeps us immature, stops us applying our own minds? Well, it's the monarchical structures that are rather imposing, because it's those structures that enforce the pay, pray, and obey. These are forces that keep us in a cosmology that is not allowing us to be mature. Is it the nobility in cahoots with the monarchical structures? Is it a class system that keeps the poor where they are? These are impositions that keep us immature, says Kant. But here's the question for us that was posed sharply in the Enlightenment era. Does the church keep us immature? Is it actually in cahoots with those structures like the monarchies, like the nobility? Is that where it finds its identity and its power and its impact? Because if it is, then for Enlightenment thinkers, for many of them, that's going to be a challenge and a problem to overcome. Let's grow like trees and be mature, build the forests. This is the Enlightenment. Voltaire, some would call the Enlightenment actually the age of Voltaire because his impact is so significant. Others would say it's the age of reason, the age of Kant. But actually Voltaire looks back to Martin Luther of the Reformation. And he says, look, a corner of the veil was lifted by Martin Luther himself. The nations aroused wanted to judge what they had worshipped. So he somewhat satirically gives credit to Martin Luther. He is no Lutheran and no fan of the Reformed teaching, of the church teaching at this time. But he's saying, look, I can point back to that. This is the fruits of that work that was done centuries before. Why? Because in the Reformation of the 16th century, that was genuinely a spirit of protest against constructs that were considered to keep us immature. You see the segue in the play there. There's a predisposition to challenge religious authority, in that case of the Roman Catholic Church. Therefore, a church that is saying that it is constantly reforming is doing what the Enlightenment thinkers and philosophers are saying let's do, with a critical lens. Think about it through your critical inquiry. It's also the time from the 16th century of the great universities. These are spaces where you will get skilled experts in particular areas, in linguistics and all kinds of areas, that will be new spaces where ideas can be formed and circulated. And that's a shift, because previously the spaces that were there were really church spaces. But now you have a slightly different space. It's the university space, which is going to run riot with good ideas and scientific method that comes in. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another one of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, he said that a revolution was necessary to bring men and women back to common sense. For him, the Enlightenment is not some grand academic exercise, it's just bringing us back to common sense, a common sense that had been denied to us through those very constructs that keep us immature. His famous line, of course, you'll have heard before, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Rousseau says that when the infant comes out from the womb, what's the first thing we do with it? Wrap it up! Then we go through life, and it's a life through the church. And then we die. Nail it in coffin. Where's the freedom in that? Is the church something that sets us free, or is it something that constricts us? Okay. The idea of Christianity as some huge galleon blown onto the rocks, then pounded by the seas and plundered by coastal predators in an age of reason and materialism is mistaken. let's get the impression that we have a split polarizing thing where we have Enlightenment thinkers over here who want to do all they can to destroy the church. And you have the church folks over here who are desperately trying to understand themselves in the midst of the great enemy. That's just not true. It's not historically true at all. There is much more of a complicated nexus going on. There are Christians who very much support the Enlightenment, and in fact will be some of the main drivers of it, particularly in the 17th century. People like Francis Bacon, René Descartes, I think therefore I am, are Christians, and they are trying to use reason in a way that is going to enrich the Christian faith and not denounce it. But as we move into the 18th century, there will be some kind of a separation here, as Christians start to lose a little bit of credibility within intellectual discourse. But we can't see this as an either-or. It really is a both-and. The Enlightenment is being fed by Christian thinkers as well. What we get to is a place where reason is suddenly going to be lifted up in the hierarchy of things. It's going to supersede faith as the top of the hierarchy. Reason largely supersedes revelation as the supreme court of appeal. Oh, think about that for a moment. Reason comes onto the ground so hard and fast that it is now considered to be the lens in which even divine revelation is to be assessed. This is somewhat new in the Enlightenment period. It might be able to trace itself back earlier, but this comes to the force in the Enlightenment period. So Christian theologians, they faced a choice, says Alistair McGrath, the great theologian. The first choice is to adjust itself to the advance in modern science and philosophy, which is making great strides in things using scientific method and thought, and also philosophical developments, but in so doing, risking accommodating to it. In other words, Christian theologians are having to adjust now to the way the world is shown to be through science, through scientific application, new findings, through science. What do theologians do with that? Do they adjust to it? The other option is to resist all of that, bury the head in the sand, and become largely just a reactionary and ineffectual force in meeting the challenge of the new modern world in the 18th century. This is the tension in which Christian theologians are finding themselves. Even those who embrace Enlightenment thinking, the heartbeat of the Enlightenment, the use of reason, are slowly going to find themselves out of intellectual discourse. The backdrop, let's just look at the backdrop leading up to the Enlightenment, and this is the 30 Years' War, the most catastrophic, destructive war right up to the 20th century and the Great World Wars. Absolutely devastating. And while there is arguments about the place of religion in causing this war, there is no doubt that religion played a significant part in it. The destruction with the Protestants and the Catholics fighting one another under national banners, absolutely brutal. With the Treaty of Westphalia that came in 1648, we have a shift. I'm going to read this. I know it's long, but bear with me, please. Perhaps rulers should not allow their decisions to be guided by religious or confessional considerations, but rather by their own self-interest or by the interests of their subjects. Oh, this is new. This is new. Thus, the modern secular state began to develop amongst this time through these questions, as did doubt regarding matters that previous generations had taken for granted. On what grounds did theologians dare to affirm that they were correct and that therefore others were mistaken? Could any doctrine be true that produced the destruction of the 30 Years' War? Was there not a more tolerant, more profound, and even more Christian way to serve God than simply following the dictates of orthodoxy, whether that be Catholic or Protestant? When you've had the destruction of a war like that, people are fed up. They don't want to lose any more people. They don't want to lose their families or their communities to the death that seems to be driven by a difference in religious identity between Protestant and Catholic. In 1688, slightly later than that 30 Years' War, we have in England the invitation by the English to bring in William of Orange from the Netherlands and Mary to bring in a period of religious toleration. We've had the Puritans, and the Puritans, many of them have been moving to the Americas. But in the United Kingdom, in England, there is a period of religious toleration. If a multiplicity of religions is harmful to the state, that is only because one religion will not tolerate the other, but wants to swallow it up by directive persecution. That's where the trouble lies. Let's not claim to have one tradition, religious tradition, and impose it on everybody. We've tried that, it just hasn't worked. It's been too destructive. Let's have toleration. There's a novel idea, isn't there? Let's let the Methodists be Methodists. Let's let the Baptists be the Baptists. And let those who want to be in the Church of England be in the Church of England. Not so sure about those Quakers, but let's give it a go. This is them talking at the time. I'm not saying that right now. Love the Quakers. Because, of course, it's always a fine line about who you want to expand the boundary out to tolerate, isn't it? In France, this gets us back into the heart of the Enlightenment heartbeat, if you like. We've had Louis XV, who had revoked the Edict of Nantes. Now, the Edict of Nantes is very important because this was another move towards religious toleration. This came after the tragedies of the 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris, where many Protestants were killed. Again, war and destruction at the hands of religious identity. So there was the Edict of Nantes that came to say enough. Religious toleration might be a way forward. But then Louis XV comes along and he revokes that idea of religious toleration and once again wants to impose his particular religion on everybody. And watch out those who don't fall in line. Protestantism was made illegal in 1685. This is baffling to people who have lived in a time period of religious toleration and are making it work. And now they're going back in time to a place where there is no religious toleration, but is once again imposed by on high, by these monarchical rulers. So we get to Voltaire. Voltaire, by the way, a little later in his life, he writes Candide. And if you haven't been introduced to Voltaire, this is a great place to start. He writes this as a satirical piece on the political and philosophical climate of the day. And as soon as the authorities read it, what do? They ban it. But because they ban it, 30,000 copies are sold within a week. Don't ban it. If you want people to read it, then ban it. The case of Jean Calas. He's a Protestant who's accused of allegedly murdering his son because his son wanted to become a Catholic. And in the end, he was executed. We see a depiction of it over here, the brutality of the wheel. And we see the Bishop of Toulouse standing right here, almost orchestrating the event. Voltaire says, no, this can't be the way. This is no way for us to progress. Certainly, this is no way to maturity. There's got to be another way. Jeremy, is it possible to get our short video up at this time? There's going to be some French language being spoken, but hopefully you'll be able to see the Hi, Jackie. It must be down here somewhere. That's okay. Oh, it is? Wow. Round of applause for Jackie, by the way. Take that back.
Endorsed God's power, and he was buried with great ceremony in Westminster Abbey, where England honours its heroes. Newton's funeral was thronged with admirers, including this man, Voltaire. He was the most fearless and prolific thinker and writer in France, a country which at the time brutally repressed any freedom of thought or expression.
That's it. That's it. Just take it off.
Il a traversé tout le siècle des Lumières comme un véritable météore. Et c'est aussi et surtout l'homme qui a inventé la figure de l'intellectuel.
Let's just take it off.
C'est-à-dire de l'écrivain engagé dans tous les combats de son temps pour défendre la veuve, l'orphelin et toutes les victimes des crimes et horreurs judiciaires perpétrés par des régimes autoritaires.
Voltaire's crusade forced him to spend most of his life in exile, which is why he was in England.
We'll just take that off. We'll put this back on.
Must be those pesky Quakers.
See, we had this working perfectly this morning, of course. Isn't it the way? Great. I will send these slides to you, by the way, so that they can be posted. And if anybody's interested in looking down, although there's a small clip, you can see the whole thing because it's really quite powerful. There's a section on Isaac Newton. Of course, there's an imposing figure for our conversation, and then also Voltaire, and then eventually Diderot. Denis Diderot was the founder, really, of the encyclopedia movement that will be instrumental to our time. It looks like my time is up. Thank you.
You've heard that error is human.
Yes, that's
It takes
right.
a computer to really screw things up, right?
Yes, thank you, Jackie. I appreciate that. That was a great clip, by the way. But essentially what it was going to say was that in some period Voltaire was actually exiled to England. He goes there, and since William of Orange and Mary had come in 1688 into England, there had been this emphasis towards religious toleration. And he was just feeling like he was breathing fresh air. This is the way it must be, thought Voltaire. To have it any other way is just too destructive to humanity, to the whole of the world. The application of reason leads us to religious toleration, surely, for Voltaire at least. But what he was really taken aback by was the freedom of speech. The freedom of speech is something that we take for granted today. And yet, it was not something that you took for granted at this time period. It's not pay, pray, obey, and have freedom of speech. It's just pay, pray, and obey. So the new ideas that were coming from the English Revolution with this freedom of speech is something that Voltaire really pushed through his writings, and he brought that back to the context of France. So reason, human reason, suddenly becomes the second Copernican revolution. There had been a huge revolution, a Copernican revolution that came through the idea of the heliocentric model of the universe, where the sun is the center of all things. You know, until we knew that, this is radical information coming in. Well, the Enlightenment, the place of reason in the center of the cultural universe from this time period, is considered to be the second Copernican revolution. It is that significant. And friends, we have still, even today, we are still trying to find our way to answer and respond to it. What do we embrace from the Enlightenment, and what must be we resist, if anything at all, are the new questions. Reason now becomes the supreme authority over faith itself. Why? Because reason can be used to discern even the truth that had been assumed from the religious realm. If religion, Sherlock Holmes, if religion was the principal villain of the Enlightenment, at least in the 18th century radical period, then science was its hero. We get that. Science embodied reason, and the scientific worldview embodied a rational perspective freed from religion and superstition. Anything that had a sniff of superstition, no thank you very much. Keep it to yourself. Certainly the space of intellectual discourse was blocking out to the periphery anybody who wanted to bring things that could not be reasonably argued. All religions were to come up to scrutiny, but especially Christianity in this period of the world. Everything, of course, not just religion, but political and other authority must be subject to the critique of reason. It's the new kid on the block. If it were to commend itself to the respect of all humanity, but particularly suspect was religious truth and superstition. Humanity was surely not innately corrupt as Catholicism had taught, nor was the good life found only in the beatific state of otherworldly salvation. The natural universe, governed not by a miraculous whimsy of a supernatural God, was ruled by rational scientific laws, which were accessible to human beings through the scientific method of experiment and empirical observation. We get a nudging out of those things religious connected with any sense of the supernatural, any sense of the miracles, any sense of the narratives that had been used before, the assumptions used to justify the centrality of faith and religion in the world. Christianity can be derived from reason itself. There was no need to invoke the idea of divine revelation. We don't need divine revelation to know. We can know because we use our reason. And surely we'll come to similar conclusions, said some Christians. Reason could judge the claims of revelation, able to eliminate anything irrational or superstitious. I think you get the point. So John Locke, we talked about earlier, this is one of the folks that Jefferson had said, one of the three greatest thinkers that ever lived. He was really critical of those who seemed to be just so fanatical in their claims for divine revelation. And of course interpreting divine revelation however they wanted to, that seemed to make no sense. God spoke to me in this way and I'm sticking to it. But he said surely reason would show that Christianity was indeed the most reasonable of religions. Let's use reason to justify and prove Christianity is the top religion, better than some of the others that are now being known about. So there is an assumed hierarchy of religions, but this is soon going to topple as well. I'm going to skip these slides for the sake of time, but these are just expressions of different religions. These are images coming from around the world as people are coming back into Europe, bringing these images, saying this is what it looks like to be in India and to see the god Ganesha. And here are Native Americans in Virginia performing a sacred rite. These images are coming back and they're being looked at and they're being dissected and people are interested in asking new questions. But one of the striking things about what is happening with this birth of religion, if you like, and John Locke's idea of tabula rasa, that is that we are all born with a clean slate. We're not born with anything inherent in us. We are born with a clean slate, and therefore what education will provide is going to shape who we become. Now, the striking thing about that is that it goes against the notion of anything kind of universal, of an absolute monolithic that is going to look the same everywhere in the world. Of course it will look differently in different parts of the world. Why? Because different people in different parts of the world with a tabula rasa, an open mind, will have it filled in slightly different ways. Culturalisms will come in, folk tales, music, and so on and so forth. Locke says there should be no surprise then that in fact religious reality, religion which he thinks everybody has, that's why it looks different all over the world. Because we're educated in certain ways, in certain directions, depending on where we come from in the world. This is reasonable, says Locke. But of course, for Locke as a Christian, he still considers that ultimately Christianity is the best expression of religion, but soon his voice will be one of the minor voices. One of the striking things that happens in Paris, this is a Notre Dame cathedral that has been central to the city of Paris and to the Catholic Church, certainly in France, and therefore the rest of Europe. Look what we have here. It's a procession around the streets in 1793, just after the French Revolution, of equality and liberty and fraternity. Yeah? These great ideas of human liberty and freedom that will shape the modern world. We've had some of this in the United States, as is now formed. or in the American Revolution. But what we have here in France is a great testimony to the shift that's taken place. This procession comes into Notre Dame Cathedral, and a lot of the Christian iconography is removed. And in its place on the altar will remain there as a central place in the cathedral. But instead of it being Christian images there will be the goddess of reason. This is now who we worship. Or actually, this is now what we worship. This is not idolatry in the sense of it being Christian figures being replaced by the goddess of reason and now we worship the goddess. No, but we give great reverence to the concept of reason. Some might worship it, I suppose, but really it's just a significant shift in the sensibility of the land. We're getting a sense of the heartbeat of the people. There's not just a few people on this procession, there is a lot of people willing to say this signifies the changes about to come. In France at this time, there's an attempt to change the calendars away and strip it from any of the Christian connotation of the calendar year, to offer new months that give great respect to the philosophers. This, my friends, is seismic. Because the question is then, what does Christianity do about it? What does it embrace? What does it reject? How does it know itself? And what are the opportunities and the questions that need to be asked moving forward? There are new spaces being formed. We talked about the rise of the university, where the university space now becomes a place where ideas can be shared and circulated, as opposed to the Christian church, the significance of the place of worship itself. But now we have the formation of something else. It's a new social space where ideas are circulated. It's the coffee shops. It's the coffee shops and it's the salons. Now these salons, there's a hierarchy of them. There are the best ones in Paris and there are the ones that are slightly less dodgy. Everybody wants to be in the best ones. But guess what? Your invitation to the best ones is not about your nobility or your status. The lowly peasant can be at the top elite salon if they have an idea that will run. If there's somebody who's got a well-reasoned idea, bring it. It's a destruction of a class system, if you like. It's the litmus test is the ideas that you have. So in London at this time, we have this thing called the Grub Street Press. This is your lowly, I suppose, journalists who are trying to get their foot up on the ladder. So there really is a hierarchy, but everybody's getting into the pulse of new ideas that are coming in. What are they sharing? It's not just to come in for a jolly old chat and a nice cup of tea. Not at all. It's to come together to learn about the new ideas that are coming into the encyclopedia. New entries are being offered all the time. This is the birth of the encyclopedia. Yeah? We've all been to an encyclopedia. Facts, knowledge, information. This is our guide moving forward. Denis Diderot, the great French thinker who was exiled and put in jail for a while for his freedom of speech, is pioneering this new way of attaining knowledge. And when the knowledge comes in, people want to talk about it. This is the Procope in Paris. Has anybody been to the Procope? Yeah, oh, isn't it beautiful? This is one of the spaces that literally changed the modern world. You can go into this space, and Jefferson had been in here, and others had been in here. Benjamin Franklin had been in here, and they drank coffee together. It was a space away from other spaces to be able to sit and talk. I mean, it's a bit of a stretch to say, look at the way we drink our coffee today, but where are the spaces when you want to meet somebody? Where do you say, let's meet? Let's go meet in the coffee shop. Now, we get that. Here's me. Well, this is my wife here and my 2 children. We go on holiday, okay? Julie's on sabbatical. And we go to Paris, and everybody gets to say what they want to do. The kids want to go to the Eiffel Tower. Julie wants to go to the Louvre. I want to go to the Procope. Yeah? Everybody does their things. The last day, we eventually go to the Procope, and we're sitting there. There's Voltaire's table right there. There's Rousseau's table right there. We look at the tables where Rousseau and Diderot had their debates and conversations. And I'm breathing it in saying, kids, this is where the world changed. And my kids said, Dad, you are so boring. You are so boring. Let's go. Totally sulked about that. Still sulking a little bit about that. But what we're finding is, and of course this is too simplistic, but we're seeing a separation here. A separation of facts, truths that can be verified and proved, over and against faith and values. This is an important separation. This is a recognition that in the public square, in the public space, this is a space for intellectual discourse. Bring your facts, bring your truths, but please leave your superstitious faiths behind. Or take them to a space that is not this space. And so we get this split between the public space and the private space. Jefferson himself will say, I don't mind if your neighbor worships one god or 100 gods. What matters is whether they come out onto the streets and want to pick your pocket or break your leg. That's really what matters for Jefferson. Now, this is not a knock on religion. It's not a spitting on the floor when anybody mentions religion, but it is a recognition that because you cannot verify your faith thoughts, your superstitions, or your ideas on miracles, you can't do that in intellectual discourse, so keep it to yourself. Keep it in the private realm. So the Bible now gets scrutinized more than it ever had, but critically scrutinized. Because the miracles that had been in Scripture had always been used for the proof of the existence of God. God exists because look at the miracles God was able to do in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But now folks are saying, you've got to keep that in the private realm. Because they're your faith perspectives and your values. But miracles, they're a bit dodgy. Christianity was coming under intellectual threat. There's not a single religion that does not force its devotees to swallow a few scientific absurdities. Think about it. So what about miracles? This is just one example of the pressure coming under Christianity. We have the creation stories, certainly miraculous. The healing stories, the exorcisms that Jesus performs over demonic spirits. The cleaning of eyes to make people see, to make people hear. And the virgin birth. These had always been assumed stories of truth that had really been the edifice, the bolstering of Christian faith and identity. But now in the modern world of facts, values, and facts and reason, then these come under scrutiny. David Hume is a person that we might turn to think about these miracles. He says a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. It's a violation of the laws of nature or the uniformity of nature. He says, I've never seen a miracle. I've never seen the laws of nature suddenly change. Actually, Hume is not saying that miracles aren't real. He's just saying we can't really ever know. We can't really even use reason to determine the truth of a miracle, and therefore it needs to be set aside from this discourse. For example, Jesus walking on the water, he says, did the density of the water suddenly change to allow Jesus to be up above the water? If we're going by the laws of science and knowledge, then surely the density must have changed to keep him up there. And if that's the case, why did Peter sink? It was just this bit that changed. And these are questions that are now being asked, the freedom to ask these questions. And it's puzzling and it's challenging for folks within Christianity. David Hume's essay on miracles, I'd encourage you to go and look at it. He says, in all my years, nature has been uniform. Look what he says further. If one honest person reported to the king that a battle had been won down the road, Diderot, the great philosopher, would have been inclined to believe him. But if all Paris declared that a man had risen from the dead, Diderot would not believe a word of it. This is striking. If just one person came and said, I have seen a battle being won, you would be inclined to say, wow, this is good or bad, depending on the side of what you were. But if the whole of Paris came and told Diderot, a man has been risen from the dead, he couldn't believe it. Again, this is a seismic shift in the very thinking of Enlightenment thinkers. Christianity, I love this slide. Christianity is left out of intellectual discourse. Christians were now challenged to defend the doctrine of divinity of Christ without the use of miraculous events. This is going to be the time period when we have a resurgence of things like the Unitarian Church, which had been around for a while, and certainly back into the time of the Reformation. Folks had denied the Trinity, for whatever reason. We think of Michael Servetus, who was executed in Geneva at the hands of John Calvin, and his heresy was that he didn't believe in the Trinity. But now this is taking new shape in the Enlightenment era, where the Unitarians are saying we can't believe in the divinity of Jesus. Well, you can see how this would take hold, such a thought. Christianity is being left out of intellectual discourse. It will have spaces to share its ideas, but those are going to be constricted within its own walls. How, therefore, is it going to respond? And that's the journey that we're going to take over the next few weeks. Because it will respond, it will want to take center stage again, it will want to take Enlightenment values to heart, it will want to embrace some and neglect others in order to say this is what Christianity can mean in the modern world. So friends, please come back. Please invite your friends. If the numbers go down, and again, let me remind you, if you have a question, please get it to one of the clergy and they can get it to me, or feed in ideas for how this trajectory goes. I have an idea, but it's not all fixed and written down. I can adapt it and change it depending on what your wishes are. So please feel free to offer your input. Friends, thank you very much.